The morning air above Rechlin carried the sharp metallic taste of aviation fuel mixed with pine, a combination that had become as familiar to Hauptmann Hans Werner Lerche as his own reflection. He stood on the tarmac of the Luftwaffe's primary test facility, 40 miles north of Berlin, watching ground crews prepare an aircraft that shouldn't exist here. The bomber sat massive and alien against the German landscape, its olive-drab paint still bearing the faded white star of the United States Army Air Forces. Someone had painted crude crosses over the American markings, but the effort felt temporary, almost apologetic, as though even the paint knew this machine didn't belong. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Lerche had flown nearly everything the Reich could build: Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, experimental jets whose blueprints still smelled of fresh ink. He understood aircraft the way a surgeon understands anatomy, reading performance in the curve of a wing, the placement of an engine, the distribution of weight. But this Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress presented something different. This wasn't just an aircraft to evaluate. This was the materialization of everything German propaganda had spent years dismissing. The bomber had been captured nearly intact after an emergency landing in occupied France during the summer of 1943. Its crew had scattered into the countryside, leaving behind a machine the Luftwaffe command immediately recognized as valuable beyond measure. Within weeks it had been transported to Rechlin, stripped of obvious damage, and assigned to Lerche for comprehensive evaluation. The orders were explicit: fly it, test it, find its weaknesses, report how best to destroy it. Yet standing before it now, Lerche felt an uncomfortable stirring he couldn't name. The B-17 looked impossibly large, its 4 Wright Cyclone engines gleaming dully in the overcast light. More unsettling were the gun positions. 13 50 caliber Browning machine guns protruded from various turrets and windows like the quills of some mechanical predator. He had read intelligence reports claiming American bombers flew in defensive formations, relying on overlapping fields of fire rather than speed or maneuverability. The theory sounded reasonable on paper, but theory had a way of dissolving when metal met sky. Oberst Friedrich, the facility's commanding officer, approached with a folder tucked under his arm. His face carried the perpetual weariness of a man tasked with translating failure into progress. "Lerche," he said, nodding toward the bomber, "ready to see what the Americans have been throwing at us." Lerche kept his eyes on the aircraft, as ready as anyone can be to climb into the enemy's machine. Friedrich handed him the folder. Inside were technical specifications translated from captured manuals, diagrams of the defensive armament layout, and a single-page memo from Reichsmarschall Goering himself. The memo was brief and unnervingly confident. It claimed American bombers were poorly defended, their crews undertrained, their tactics predictable. It assured the test pilots that weaknesses would be obvious. Lerche closed the folder slowly. Goering had never flown a B-17. He had never sat in the cockpit of an aircraft built by a nation with resources Germany could only imagine. The Reichsmarschall's confidence felt less like analysis and more like wishful thinking dressed in official language. "Have you reviewed the defensive positions?" Friedrich asked. Lerche nodded. 13 guns, interlocking fields of fire covering nearly every approach angle. Friedrich's expression tightened. "On paper, yes, but paper doesn't account for human limitations. Gunners get tired. They panic. They waste ammunition. Your job is to find the gaps they can't cover, no matter how well designed the system appears." The logic was sound, but something about it felt incomplete. Lerche had spent enough time in combat to know that well-designed systems often performed better than poorly designed ones, regardless of human factors. If the Americans had truly engineered overlapping defensive coverage, dismissing it as theory seemed dangerous. He walked closer to the bomber, his boots crunching on loose gravel. Up close, the machine revealed details intelligence photographs couldn't capture. The riveting was precise, almost obsessive in its uniformity. The aluminum skin, though scuffed from its forced landing, showed no signs of shoddy construction. The plexiglass nose cone gleamed, offering the bombardier an unobstructed view that must have felt both empowering and terrifying. Lersch climbed the ladder and stepped inside through the waist gun position. The interior smelled faintly of oil, sweat, and something else he couldn't identify. Perhaps the residue of fear left by the crew who'd abandoned it. The cramped fuselage felt colder than the outside air, as though the metal itself remembered its origin in American factories far beyond the Atlantic. He moved forward carefully, ducking beneath structural beams until he reached the cockpit. The pilot's seat was surprisingly comfortable, designed for long missions where endurance mattered as much as skill. The instrument panel stretched wide, filled with gauges, switches, and indicators labeled in English. Lersch's English was functional, learned from technical manuals and interrogations of captured airmen. He traced his fingers over the controls, reading their purposes: throttle quadrant, fuel mixture, propeller pitch, supercharger controls. Everything was methodical, logical, built for crews who needed clarity under stress. He settled into the seat and gripped the yoke. It felt heavier than German designs, less responsive, as though the aircraft expected deliberate inputs rather than instinctive reactions. The B-17 wasn't built for dogfighting. It was built for endurance, for carrying tons of explosives across hostile skies while absorbing punishment that would shred lighter aircraft. That realization settled uncomfortably in Lersch's chest. German fighters had been designed around speed and agility, assuming enemies would either flee or fall. But the B-17 didn't flee, it absorbed. Friedrich's voice called from outside. "We've fueled it and run preliminary checks. Engines are operational, whenever you're ready." Lersch climbed back out and stood beside the nose, staring up at the chin turret. The twin .50 caliber guns pointed forward, covering the most vulnerable approach angle for any attacking fighter. He imagined himself in a Messerschmitt, diving toward this nose at 400 kilometers per hour. And suddenly, the theoretical fields of fire became vivid. From below, the ball turret. From the sides, waist gunners. From above, the top turret. From behind, the tail guns. Every direction accounted for, every angle watched. He turned to Friedrich. "Have we test-fired the defensive guns?" "Not yet. We wanted your assessment of the flight characteristics first." Lersch nodded, though part of him wanted to see those guns in action, to understand whether their placement was as effective as it appeared. The ground crew finished their final checks, and Lersch returned to the cockpit. A German flight engineer, specially trained on captured American equipment, took the seat beside him. The man's name was Weber, young, nervous, clearly aware that flying an enemy bomber carried risks beyond mechanical failure. "Ready?" Lersch asked. Weber swallowed. "As much as I can be, Herr Hauptmann." Lersch began the startup sequence, methodically working through each step. The Wright Cyclone engines coughed, sputtered, then roared to life one by one, their deep thrum vibrating through the airframe. The sound was different from German engines, rougher, more aggressive, as though the machinery itself carried a certain blunt determination. He advanced the throttles carefully, feeling the bomber's weight resist movement before grudging forward. Taxiing felt awkward, the nose blocking much of his forward view, forcing him to weave slightly to see the runway ahead. German fighters didn't have this problem. They were nimble, responsive, designed for pilots who valued visibility and control. The B-17 demanded patience, trust in instruments, acceptance that some things would remain unseen. When Lersha reached the runway threshold, he paused, running through the final checks. Everything appeared normal. He glanced at Weber, who gave a tense nod. Then Lersha pushed the throttles forward. The engines bellowed, their combined power shaking the bomber as it accelerated down the runway. The tail lifted, the nose dropped slightly, and suddenly the world beyond the plexiglass opened wider. Speed built slowly, the bomber's mass resisting the sky's invitation. Then, at precisely the speed the manual predicted, the wheels lifted, and the B-17 climbed. Lersha felt the shift immediately. The aircraft wasn't graceful. It didn't soar. It climbed with stubborn, relentless efficiency, as though it had decided the sky would yield simply because yielding was the only logical outcome. He retracted the landing gear and adjusted the throttles, settling into a steady climb. Below, Recklin's runways shrank, the pine forests spreading outward like dark water. The altitude gauge climbed past 1,000 meters, then 2,000. The air thinned. The engines maintained their steady roar. Weber glanced at the manifold pressure gauges. "Everything is stable, Herr Hauptmann. No anomalies." Lersha nodded but said nothing. His attention had shifted to something else, something he hadn't expected. The B-17 felt solid. Not nimble, not quick, but solid in a way that suggested it could endure forces that would break lesser machines. He banked gently, testing the controls. The bomber responded slowly, predictably, without drama. It wasn't trying to impress. It was simply doing what it was built to do. As they leveled off at 4,000 meters, Lersha's mind returned to the defensive armament. He imagined German fighters approaching from various angles, trying to exploit weaknesses. From directly ahead, the chin turret. From behind, the tail guns. From above or below, the top and ball turrets. From the sides, waist gunners. The coverage seemed exhaustive, and that troubled him more than gaps would have. Gaps could be exploited. Comprehensive coverage required rethinking German tactics entirely. He keyed the intercom. "Weber, I want you to move through the aircraft. Inspect each gun position. Tell me what you see." Weber unbuckled and disappeared aft. Lersha continued flying, his thoughts drifting between the machine's behavior and the uncomfortable implications forming in his mind. Minutes passed. Then Weber's voice returned, slightly breathless. "Herr Hauptmann, the fields of fire overlap significantly. The waist guns can cover approaches the ball turret misses. The top turret has nearly 360 degrees of rotation. Even the tail guns have wider arcs than I expected." Lersch absorbed the information silently. He had hoped for blind spots, angles where a skilled pilot could approach without facing concentrated fire. Instead, the Americans had designed redundancy into their defensive system, assuming that even if one gunner failed, another would compensate. It was engineering born from abundance, from a nation that could afford to add weight, complexity, and firepower because resources weren't scarce. Germany built aircraft light and fast because fuel, metals, and manufacturing capacity were precious. America built them heavy and resilient because they could. The realization settled like cold water in Lersch's gut. This wasn't just an aircraft. This was a philosophy made tangible. And if this philosophy extended beyond bombers, if it shaped American tanks, ships, and entire strategies, then the war's trajectory suddenly looked very different from what propaganda claimed. He banked the B-17 into a wide turn, descending gradually toward Rechlin. The bomber handled the descent with the same methodical patience it had shown climbing. Nothing about it suggested panic or fragility. It simply flew, absorbing turbulence, maintaining course, indifferent to the doubts blooming in its temporary pilot's mind. As the runway appeared ahead, Lerche prepared for landing, lowering the gear and adjusting flaps. The bomber settled onto the tarmac with surprising gentleness, the tires chirping once before the weight transferred fully. He taxied back to the apron, shut down the engines, and sat in the sudden silence. Weber looked at him. "What do you think, Herr Hauptmann?" Lerche didn't answer immediately. He stared through the windscreen at the German ground crew approaching, their expressions curious, expectant. They wanted weaknesses. They wanted reassurance. They wanted confirmation that the enemy's machine, impressive as it appeared, could still be beaten with the tools Germany possessed. But Lerche wasn't sure he could give them that. The debriefing room at Rechlin smelled of stale coffee and cigarette smoke, both comforts that had long since stopped providing comfort. Oberst Friedrich sat across from Lerche, a notepad open between them, his pen poised expectantly. Outside, mechanics were already preparing the B-17 for the next phase of testing, the phase that would answer the question everyone had been avoiding. Could the defensive armament actually perform as designed? Friedrich broke the silence first. "Your initial impression of the flight characteristics?" Lerche chose his words carefully. "Stable, predictable, built for crews who need consistency over long missions. The handling is heavy but not unresponsive. It climbs well despite the weight." Friedrich made notes without looking up. "Weaknesses in maneuverability?" Lerche nodded. "It cannot dogfight. Any competent fighter pilot could outturn it within seconds." But he paused. "That assumes the fighter survives long enough to exploit the advantage." Friedrich's pen stopped. "Elaborate." Lerche leaned forward. "The defensive coverage is more comprehensive than intelligence suggested. The gun positions overlap in ways that create redundant fields of fire. An attacking fighter doesn't face one gun. It faces 3 or 4 simultaneously from different angles." Friedrich's expression tightened. "That's why we need the live fire test. Theory is meaningless without practical verification. We need to know if those guns can actually track and engage a maneuvering target." The live fire test had been scheduled for the following morning. The plan was methodical. German fighters would make simulated attack runs against the B-17, while observers measured the defensive gun's tracking ability, rate of fire, and effective range. The bomber would be anchored on the ground initially, its engines running, to power the turrets, with experienced Luftwaffe gunners manning the positions to eliminate crew skill as a variable. If the system worked as designed, even with German gunners unfamiliar with American equipment, it would confirm Lerche's growing suspicion. The B-17's defense wasn't dependent on exceptional crews. It was built into the machine itself. That night, Lerche found sleep elusive. He lay in his quarters staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the flight. He kept returning to a single moment during the descent, when he'd looked back through the fuselage, seeing the gun positions arrayed like a steel constellation. Each .50 caliber Browning represented American industrial capacity, American engineering philosophy, American assumption that more was better because more was possible. Germany had built its Luftwaffe around individual pilot skill, around aces who could turn battles through talent and aggression. America seemed to be building around systems that functioned regardless of individual excellence. The implications extended beyond aviation. If America could produce bombers with 13 machine guns each, what did that say about their capacity to produce fighters, tanks, ships? What did it say about their ability to sustain losses and replace them faster than Germany could inflict them? Lerche had seen the production figures in classified briefings. The numbers seemed impossible, exaggerated surely by Allied propaganda. But lying here in the darkness, remembering the precision of the B-17's construction, the abundance evident in every rivet, he wondered if the numbers were actually conservative. Morning arrived with low clouds and intermittent drizzle, typical for northern Germany in autumn. The weather would complicate the test slightly, but not enough to postpone it. Lerche arrived at the flight line to find the B-17 already positioned, its engines running, ground crew making final adjustments to the gun turrets. Friedrich stood nearby with a cluster of senior officers, including 2 representatives from the Reich Air Ministry who'd traveled specifically to observe. One of them, a general major named Dietrich, approached Lerche with the confidence of someone whose combat experience existed primarily in reports. "Hauptmann," he said, gesturing toward the bomber, "I'm told you believe this aircraft presents unusual defensive capabilities." Lerche measured his response. "The defensive armament is comprehensive. Today's test should clarify its practical effectiveness." Dietrich smiled thinly. "I've reviewed American bomber tactics. They rely on formation flying because individual aircraft are vulnerable. Our pilots have proven this repeatedly over Germany. One bomber alone, even with multiple guns, remains a target." Lerche wanted to argue, but recognized futility when he saw it. Dietrich had arrived with conclusions already formed. The test would either confirm his beliefs or be dismissed as anomalous. Instead, Lerche simply nodded. "That's what we're here to determine." The test began with a Messerschmitt Bf 109 approaching from the rear, the classic fighter tactic against bombers. The pilot, an experienced combat veteran named Müller, made his run at 300 meters altitude, closing to what would normally be firing range. Inside the B-17, a Luftwaffe sergeant manned the tail guns, tracking the approaching fighter through the optical sight. Lerche watched through binoculars from a safe distance. The tail guns swiveled smoothly, following Müller's approach with mechanical precision. Even though no ammunition was loaded, the gunner squeezed the triggers at intervals, and observers with stopwatches recorded the simulated engagement. The twin .50 calibers, even empty, produced a sharp, clicking rhythm that carried across the tarmac. Müller banked away and circled for another pass, this time from a slight angle to test the waist gun's response. Again, the B-17's defensive positions tracked him, the waist gunner swinging his weapon to maintain aim as the fighter crossed his field of view. Friedrich stood beside Lerche, his face unreadable. "The tracking is smooth, better than I expected." Lerche nodded. "The turrets are hydraulically powered. The gunner doesn't fight the weapon's weight. The system does most of the work. That's a significant advantage during long engagements." The test continued through various approach angles. From below, the ball turret rotated with disturbing speed, keeping the attacking fighter centered in its sights. From above, the top turret demonstrated nearly complete hemispherical coverage. From the front, the chin turret provided exactly what Lerche had feared, effective protection of the bomber's most vulnerable approach. After an hour, Friedrich called a pause. The officers gathered around a folding table where observers had compiled their data. The results were presented in clinical language, but the implications were clear. The defensive system performed as designed. Tracking was consistent across all positions. Fields of fire overlapped with minimal gaps. The rate of fire, even simulated, suggested any attacking fighter would face sustained fire from multiple guns simultaneously. Dietrich studied the report with visible irritation. "This assumes American gunners are as skilled as ours. Combat reports suggest otherwise. They waste ammunition. They panic under pressure." One of the observers, a junior officer with actual combat experience, spoke carefully. "Herr General Major, The system is designed to compensate for individual limitations. Even mediocre gunners benefit from the hydraulic turrets and overlapping coverage. Dietrich's expression hardened. Then we test that assumption. Use inexperienced gunners, farm boys who've never seen combat. If the system still performs, then your concerns have merit. The second phase of testing began that afternoon. The experienced Luftwaffe gunners were replaced with recruits barely out of basic training. None had fired aircraft weapons in combat. Their instructions were simple. Track the target, squeeze the trigger when it enters your sights, trust the equipment. Lersch watched this phase with particular intensity. If raw recruits could operate the defensive system effectively, it confirmed his deepest worry. The B-17's strength wasn't dependent on elite crews. It was democratized, built into the machine itself, accessible to anyone with minimal training. The Messerschmitt made its first pass. The tail gunner, a boy who looked no older than 19, tracked the fighter with visible nervousness. His movements were jerky, overcorrected, exactly what Dietrich had predicted. But the hydraulic turret smoothed his inputs, translating frantic adjustments into steady tracking. When he squeezed the triggers, the simulated fire would have intersected the fighter's path. Müller, flying the Messerschmitt, reported over the radio, "I'm hit." That burst would have caught my wing root. The observers made notes. The test continued. By late afternoon, the pattern was undeniable. Even inexperienced gunners achieved defensive success rates that shocked the observing officers. The system worked not despite human limitations, but around them. American engineers had designed a machine that made average men effective, transforming quantity into quality through mechanical advantage. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. That evening, Lersch sat alone in the debriefing room, staring at the compiled data. Friedrich entered quietly and poured himself coffee from a thermos that had long since gone cold. He drank it anyway. "Your assessment, Hauptmann?" Lersch didn't look up from the reports. "We've been fighting the war we wanted, not the war we're in." Friedrich sat down heavily. "Explain." Lersch gestured toward the data. "Our tactics assume bombers are vulnerable, that skilled fighter pilots can exploit their weaknesses. But the B-17 doesn't have the weaknesses we've been trained to exploit. It has comprehensive defensive coverage, resilient construction, and systems designed for crews of average skill. We need elite pilots to attack them effectively. They need only adequate gunners to defend." Friedrich absorbed this silently. Then he asked the question that had been hovering over the entire test. "Can we defeat them?" Lersch met his eyes. "Individually? Yes. A skilled pilot willing to accept risk can still bring one down. But they don't fly individually. They fly in formations where defensive fire overlaps between aircraft. What we tested today was one bomber. Imagine 50 flying together, their guns creating a defensive sphere that would shred any fighter attempting penetration." The silence that followed felt heavy with implication. Friedrich finally spoke, his voice quiet. "Dietrich won't want to hear this." Lersch shrugged. "What Dietrich wants is irrelevant. What matters is what our pilots face over Germany every day. And if we don't adapt our tactics to reality instead of preference, we'll keep losing men to a system we refuse to understand." The next morning, Lersch was summoned to present his findings to the assembled officers, including Dietrich and 2 other Air Ministry representatives. He stood before them with his report, knowing his words would be unwelcome. He began with the technical data, the tracking performance, the fields of fire, the mechanical advantages of hydraulic turrets. Then he moved to the strategic implications. The B-17's defensive system represents a fundamental shift in aerial combat philosophy, he said. It prioritizes system effectiveness over individual skill. This allows the Americans to crew their bombers with adequately trained personnel and still achieve defensive success. Our counter-tactics, which rely on individual pilot excellence, create an unsustainable exchange rate. We lose experienced pilots attacking bombers crewed by replaceable gunners. Dietrich interrupted. You're suggesting our pilots are inferior? Lerche kept his voice level. I'm suggesting our pilots are being asked to overcome a systemic advantage through individual heroism. Heroism is admirable but not scalable. The Americans are building machines that make heroism unnecessary. Dietrich stood abruptly. This is defeatist thinking. Our fighters are superior. Our pilots are the best in the world. One experienced German pilot is worth 10 American bomber crewmen. Lerche felt something crack inside him, a dam holding back weeks of accumulated doubt. He set down his report and spoke with careful precision. Herr General Major, I have flown the B-17. I have tested its defensive systems with both experienced and inexperienced gunners. The data does not support your conclusion. The machine compensates for human limitations in ways our fighters do not. If we continue tactics based on assumptions rather than evidence, we will continue losing pilots we cannot replace. The room fell silent. Friedrich looked like a man watching a career end, but Lerche felt strangely calm. He had spoken truth, and truth created its own clarity. Dietrich's face had gone red. You are dismissed, Hauptmann. Your report will be noted and evaluated by those with strategic perspective beyond test flights. Lerche gathered his papers and left. Outside, rain had begun falling, steady and cold. He walked across the tarmac toward the B-17, still parked where the tests had concluded. The bomber sat quietly in the rain, water beading on its aluminum skin. Lerche approached until he stood directly beneath the nose, looking up at the chin turret's twin 50-caliber guns. They pointed forward like accusing fingers, asking a question he couldn't answer. He thought about the American crew who'd flown this aircraft before its capture. They'd probably been terrified, far from home, tasked with missions that seemed impossible. Yet they'd climbed into this machine day after day, trusting its systems to bring them through skies filled with fighters designed specifically to kill them. And often enough, it had. That realization settled into Lerche's bones with cold finality. The B-17 wasn't invincible, but it was resilient in ways that mattered more than invincibility. It could absorb punishment, protect its crew, and complete its mission even when damaged. It represented a kind of power Germany hadn't accounted for, the power of sufficiency multiplied by abundance. Weber appeared beside him, collar turned up against the rain. They're saying you challenged Dietrich directly. Lerche nodded. I told him what the tests proved. Weber was quiet for a moment. What happens now? Lerche continued staring at the bomber. Now they'll probably ignore the report, continue current tactics, and keep losing pilots until reality forces acceptance of what could have been acknowledged today. Weber's voice dropped. Do you think we can still win? It was the question everyone had stopped asking aloud. Lerche considered it carefully, measuring his words against everything he'd learned. Win? That depends on your definition. Tactically, we can still inflict losses. Strategically? He gestured toward the B-17. They're building hundreds of these, maybe thousands. Each one represents industrial capacity we don't have, resources we can't match, and a philosophy we've been too proud to recognize. So no, not the way we've been fighting. The rain intensified. Thunder rumbled distantly. Lerche turned from the bomber and began walking back toward the hangar, leaving Weber standing alone beneath the American machine. His report would be filed, probably classified, eventually forgotten. The truth it contained would be dismissed as pessimism or defeatism, anything except what it actually was, a warning based on evidence that pride refused to accept. Inside his quarters that night, Lersha sat at his desk and began writing a second report, this one unofficial, intended for pilots who might actually listen. He detailed the B-17's defensive capabilities, suggested tactics that might improve survival rates, emphasized the importance of approach angles that minimized exposure to multiple gun positions. He knew it wouldn't change the war's trajectory, but perhaps it would save a few lives, give a few pilots information their commanders wouldn't provide. As he wrote, he heard the distant sound of aircraft engines, a training flight probably, practicing night operations. The sound faded gradually, swallowed by darkness and distance. Lersha set down his pen and closed his eyes, feeling a weariness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. He'd spent his career mastering the art of flight, believing skill and courage could overcome any obstacle. The B-17 had taught him something different. It had taught him that systems could defeat skill, that abundance could overwhelm excellence, and that wars were won not by heroes, but by nations, capable of building machines that made heroism obsolete. Outside, the rain continued falling on the captured bomber, washing away nothing, changing nothing, simply marking time until morning came and the testing resumed, and the war continued grinding forward toward conclusions that felt increasingly inevitable. The captured B-17 sat at Rechlin for another 6 months. Lersha flew it periodically, each flight confirming what the first had revealed. Other test pilots evaluated it, reaching similar conclusions with varying degrees of acceptance. Some, like Lersch, recognized the implications immediately. Others clung to familiar beliefs, insisting that German fighters flown by superior pilots would ultimately prevail. By spring of 1944, the reality Lersch had identified in his report became undeniable through sheer repetition. American bomber formations appeared over Germany with increasing frequency, their numbers growing from dozens to hundreds. The defensive boxes they flew absorbed fighter attacks that should have been devastating, their overlapping fields of fire creating exactly the lethal spheres Lersch had predicted. Luftwaffe pilots began returning with accounts that mirrored his findings, speaking in frustrated tones about bombers that refused to fall despite sustained attacks, about gunners who seemed impossibly accurate, about losses that mounted faster than replacements arrived. Lersha continued flying test missions, but his role gradually shifted. He was no longer evaluating captured aircraft to find weaknesses. He was teaching survival. Young pilots, fresh from training schools that had condensed years of instruction into months, sat in briefing rooms, listening to him describe approach angles, breakaway timing, the critical importance of never lingering in a bomber's defensive envelope. Their faces carried a mixture of eagerness and terror, the expression of men who understood abstractly that death waited above Germany, but hadn't yet internalized what that meant. He showed them diagrams of the B-17's gun positions, the same diagrams he'd included in his original report. "This is the chin turret," he'd say, pointing. 250 caliber machine guns covering frontal approaches. If you attack from directly ahead, you'll face these plus the cheek guns and potentially the top turret. Your closing speed gives you perhaps 3 seconds of firing time. In those 3 seconds, you'll be absorbing fire from at least 4 gun positions simultaneously. The young pilots took notes dutifully. Some asked intelligent questions about deflection angles and ammunition loads. Others simply stared at the diagrams with growing comprehension of what they'd volunteered for. Lersha tried to prepare them without crushing their spirit entirely, knowing that some would die regardless of training, that the mathematics of attrition favored an enemy who could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. One afternoon in May, a telegram arrived summoning Lersch to Berlin. The Reich Air Ministry wanted a personal briefing on American bomber capabilities. He made the journey with little expectation of meaningful change, but duty remained duty regardless of outcome. The ministry building showed signs of recent bombing, scaffolding covering one wing, windows replaced with boards. Inside, officers moved with the hurried precision of men managing crisis while pretending normalcy. Lerche was shown to a conference room where General Major Dietrich sat with 3 other senior officers. The atmosphere felt tense, defensive, as though Lerche's presence represented accusation rather than expertise. Dietrich spoke first. His tone clipped. "Hauptmann, your reports from Rechlin have been discussed. We've reviewed combat data from recent operations. The losses are concerning." Lerche said nothing, waiting. Dietrich continued. "Some have suggested our tactics need revision, that we should implement the recommendations you made regarding approach angles and engagement protocols. It had taken a year of unnecessary losses, of pilots killed employing tactics that ignored evidence. But Lerche kept his expression neutral. The recommendations remain valid, Herr General Major. The B-17's defensive system performs as I documented. Adjusting our tactics won't eliminate losses, but it should reduce them." One of the other officers, an Oberst named Brandt, leaned forward. Why didn't the Americans' defensive advantage appear earlier in the war? Why are we only seeing this pattern now? Lerche considered the question carefully. 2 reasons. First, early in the war, American bomber crews were inexperienced. They hadn't developed the formation tactics that maximized their defensive systems. Second, they're flying different missions now. Deep penetration raids into Germany require the endurance and defensive capability the B-17 provides. As their crews gained experience and their tactical doctrine evolved, the aircraft's inherent advantages became more apparent. Brandt nodded slowly. "And our response?" Lerche chose honesty. Our response should have been immediate tactical adaptation when the evidence first emerged. Since it wasn't, we're now implementing changes under pressure rather than proactively. The best we can do is train pilots to exploit the minimal vulnerabilities that exist, accept that some bombers will survive despite our efforts, and recognize that individual pilot heroism cannot overcome systemic disadvantage indefinitely. The room absorbed this in uncomfortable silence. Finally, Dietrich spoke again, his voice carrying less certainty than their previous encounter. "The Führer expects the Luftwaffe to stop these raids." Lerche met his eyes. "The Führer's expectations and operational reality are not always aligned. We can disrupt raids, inflict losses, force them to pay for every mission. But stop them completely? Not with current resources against an enemy who can absorb losses in return. Stronger." It was the most direct contradiction of official optimism Lerche had ever voiced. He expected anger, dismissal, perhaps worse. Instead, Dietrich simply looked exhausted. "Your recommendations will be distributed to fighter wings. Train as many pilots as you can in the revised tactics." Lerche was dismissed shortly after. Walking through Berlin's damaged streets back to his hotel, he felt no satisfaction from the belated acknowledgement. The validation had come too late, purchased with the lives of pilots who'd attacked American bombers using tactics designed for a different war. That evening, he sat in his room writing letters to families of pilots he'd known, men killed in the year between his report and its acceptance. He couldn't tell them the truth, that their sons and husbands had died because pride prevented adaptation. Instead, he wrote about bravery, sacrifice, duty. The letters felt hollow, but he wrote them anyway, adding his signature to official condolences that transformed waste into nobility. Summer arrived with intensified bombing campaigns. The revised tactics helped marginally. Losses decreased slightly, though whether from tactical changes or simple attrition of available targets remained unclear. Lerche continued training pilots, each class younger than the last, their eyes carrying less confidence, more resignation. They knew the odds. They flew anyway, because refusing meant disgrace, and disgrace in the Third Reich carried consequences beyond personal shame. In August, Lerche received new orders. He was being transferred from testing duties to active command of a fighter wing defending southern Germany. The assignment felt less like promotion and more like acknowledgement that expertise was needed where it could make immediate difference. He accepted without protest, knowing that refusing would accomplish nothing except removing him from any position of influence. His last day at Rechlin, he walked once more to where the B-17 sat. Other captured aircraft had joined it over the months, a P-51 Mustang, a British Lancaster, even a Soviet Yak-9. But the B-17 remained the most significant, the aircraft that had forced uncomfortable truths into visibility. Someone had finally painted over the American star completely, replacing it with proper German crosses. The effort seemed futile, like trying to change the machine's essential nature through cosmetic alteration. Lerche placed his hand on the cold aluminum fuselage, feeling the rivets beneath his palm. He thought about the American workers who'd assembled this bomber in some distant factory, probably thinking about lunch breaks and paychecks rather than geopolitical implications. They'd built it well, unconsciously embedding into its structure a philosophy of abundance, resilience, and systematic effectiveness. Now it sat on enemy soil, teaching lessons its creators never intended, revealing through its simple existence the fatal gap between industrial capacity and military ambition. Weber found him there carrying a folder of transfer papers. "Herr Hauptmann, your transport leaves in an hour." Lerche nodded but didn't move immediately. Weber stood quietly beside him, both men contemplating the bomber in shared understanding. Finally, Weber spoke. "Do you think they know? The Americans? Do they understand what their machines represent?" Lerche considered it. Some might, the engineers certainly, but most probably see it as just doing their jobs well. They built the best bomber they could with the resources available. The implications only become clear when you're on the other side, watching your assumptions disintegrate. Weber was quiet for a moment. "What will you tell the pilots in your new command?" Lerche turned from the bomber. "The truth. That courage matters, that skill matters, but that systemic advantages matter more. That they should fight intelligently rather than heroically, survive rather than sacrifice themselves on tactics that ignore reality. Some will listen, others won't, but at least they'll have been told." They walked together back across the tarmac. Behind them, the B-17 remained motionless, its presence a silent refutation of every comfortable assumption the Luftwaffe had carried into war. The machine asked no questions and offered no sympathy. It simply existed, representing through its sturdy construction and comprehensive defensive systems a kind of power that couldn't be defeated through individual excellence alone. Lerche's transport, an aging Junkers, waited with engines running. He climbed aboard and found a seat near the window. As the aircraft taxied and lifted, he caught one final glimpse of Rechlin's facilities below. The captured B-17 looked small from altitude, just another aircraft among many. But Lerche knew better. That bomber had taught him more about the war's trajectory than any briefing or intelligence report. It had shown him, with brutal clarity, that Germany was fighting an enemy who'd solved warfare through engineering rather than ideology, through abundance rather than excellence, through systems that worked regardless of individual brilliance. The realization carried a strange comfort. Understanding defeat didn't prevent it, but it transformed the experience from chaos into comprehension. Lersche settled into his seat as the Junkers droned southward, carrying him toward new responsibilities and familiar challenges. Below, Germany spread out in patchwork fields and scattered cities, beautiful in afternoon light, deceptive in its serenity. Soon he'd be leading pilots against bomber formations that grew larger each week, fighting battles where victory meant survival, and survival meant living to fight again tomorrow. His new command was based near Munich, a fighter wing that had suffered heavy losses in recent months. The pilots who greeted him carried the hollow-eyed exhaustion of men pushed beyond reasonable limits. Their aircraft showed signs of hasty maintenance, patched damage, deferred repairs. Everything spoke of systems straining toward collapse, of resources stretched too thin, of time running out. Lersche gathered them the first evening for an informal briefing. He dispensed with the usual optimistic rhetoric and spoke directly. "I've tested the B-17 extensively. I know its capabilities and limitations. What I'm going to teach you will increase your survival odds, but I won't promise it will make you invincible. The bombers are well designed, well defended, and supported by escorts we can't always defeat. Our job is to disrupt their missions while preserving ourselves for the next fight. Heroic suicide runs accomplish nothing except creating vacancies in formation." The pilots listened with expressions ranging from relief to skepticism. One young lieutenant raised his hand. "Herr Hauptmann, what about the official tactics manuals?" Lersche met his eyes. The manuals were written before we fully understood what we were facing. Follow my instructions instead. If headquarters objects, I'll accept responsibility. The lieutenant nodded, and Lersche saw in his face a gratitude that cut deeper than any criticism could have. These men wanted honesty, not platitudes. They wanted information that might keep them alive. Over the following weeks, Lersche drilled them on revised attack patterns, emphasizing speed, surprise, and disengagement over sustained combat. He taught them to identify which bombers in a formation were already damaged, making them easier targets than pristine aircraft. He showed them how to coordinate attacks so defensive gunners faced threats from multiple directions simultaneously, splitting their attention. None of it guaranteed survival, but it shifted odds marginally in their favor. The first mission under his command came on a clear September morning. American bombers approached in their characteristic boxes, sunlight glinting off aluminum surfaces. Lersche led his wing into position, feeling the familiar tension that preceded combat. But now the tension carried a different weight, informed by knowledge of exactly what those bombers could do. He radioed his pilots. "Remember your training. Fast pass, specific target, immediate break. Don't linger. Don't try to be heroes." They dove into the attack. Lersche selected a B-17 trailing smoke from an earlier engagement, its number 3 engine feathered. He lined up his approach from a high oblique angle, trying to minimize exposure to defensive fire. The bomber's gunners saw him coming. Tracers arced outward, bright against blue sky. He fired his own guns, saw strikes walking across the bomber's wing, then broke hard left as return fire bracketed his aircraft. The Messerschmitt shuddered from a hit, nothing critical, but enough to remind him that even damaged bombers defended themselves effectively. He climbed away, checking for damage, and saw 2 of his pilots engaging other bombers. One scored solid hits. The other broke away trailing smoke, his aircraft, wounded. The formation continued, absorbing their attacks with grim resilience, losing perhaps 2 aircraft from the entire group. After the mission, Lersche's pilots gathered for debriefing. Their faces showed the peculiar mixture of relief and frustration that came from surviving while failing to achieve decisive results. The young lieutenant who'd questioned the tactics manual spoke first. We hit them repeatedly, but they just kept flying. Lerche nodded. That's what they're designed to do. The B-17 can absorb tremendous damage and continue functioning. That's why we focus on engines and control surfaces rather than trying to destroy them outright. Disable them enough that they fall out of formation or can't reach their targets. Another pilot added quietly. Gruber didn't make it back. Silence followed. Gruber had been popular, competent, careful. His loss emphasized the fundamental inequality of the exchange. The Americans could replace a lost bomber and its crew within weeks. Germany couldn't replace Gruber or the experience he'd accumulated. Lerche acknowledged the loss with appropriate gravity, then moved on. They couldn't afford to dwell, couldn't let grief paralyze function. More missions would come, more losses would follow. The only choice was whether those losses achieved anything meaningful. Through autumn, the pattern repeated. American formations appeared with mechanical regularity. Lerche's wing engaged them, inflicted what damage they could, and watched the bombers continue toward their targets. Sometimes they disrupted missions enough to matter. More often, the bombs still fell, factories still burned, and the strategic balance shifted incrementally against Germany. Each mission confirmed what Lerche had learned at Rechlin. Individual skill could influence outcomes at tactical level, but strategic momentum belonged to the side with greater resources, better systems, and the capacity to absorb losses. Winter brought reduced operations, but no respite. Lerche used the slower tempo to continue training, to share lessons learned, to prepare his pilots for the intensified campaigns everyone knew would come with spring. He wrote detailed after-action reports, knowing most would be filed and forgotten, but writing them anyway because documentation created the possibility, however remote, that someone somewhere might learn from accumulated experience. In December, word reached him that the captured B-17 at Rechlin had been destroyed during an Allied bombing raid. The news carried dark tyranny. The aircraft that had survived combat, capture, and extensive testing had finally been eliminated by its own side, bombers likely identical to itself, dropping ordnance that erased it from existence. Lerche felt an unexpected pang at the loss, as though losing a teacher who'd delivered unwelcome but essential lessons. He never forgot what that bomber had taught him. The truth of American industrial power, the effectiveness of systematic design, the way abundance could overcome excellence through sheer persistence. Those lessons informed every decision he made, every tactic he taught, every mission he planned. They didn't change the war's outcome, but they changed how he fought it, shifting from pursuit of glory to focus on survival, from heroic gestures to calculated effectiveness. The war ground on through 1945, each week bringing fresh evidence of Germany's deteriorating position. Lerche's wing continued operations even as fuel grew scarce. Replacement parts disappeared, and new pilots arrived with training barely adequate for basic flight, much less combat. He did what he could with what he had, knowing it wasn't enough, accepting the limitation without surrendering to despair. On a gray April morning, orders came to cease offensive operations. The war was ending, not through triumph or negotiation, but through exhaustion and collapse. Lerche gathered his remaining pilots and told them simply that they'd done their duty, that survival itself constituted success, that history would judge their efforts with more perspective than the present moment allowed. In the final days, he thought often about the B-17, about the American crew who'd flown it before capture, about the workers who'd assembled it, about the philosophy embedded in its rivets and gun turrets. That bomber had represented a vision of warfare he'd been taught to dismiss as crude, wasteful, lacking the elegance of German engineering. But elegance, he'd learned, mattered less than effectiveness. The Americans had built machines that worked, crewed them with adequate personnel, and deployed them in sufficient numbers to overwhelm defenses predicated on individual excellence. The lesson extended beyond aviation, beyond military tactics, into fundamental questions about power, resources, and the relationship between quality and quantity. Germany had bet everything on quality, on superior technology, and superior warriors defeating numerically larger but presumed inferior forces. America had countered with systematic advantages that made superiority irrelevant. They didn't need the best bomber. They needed good enough bombers produced in overwhelming numbers. They didn't need elite gunners. They needed systems that made average gunners effective. Lerche survived the war and its aftermath, carrying memories of machines that had taught him uncomfortable truths. He never flew combat again, but he never forgot the cold realization that had settled into his chest that day at Rechlin when he'd climbed down from the B-17 and understood with absolute clarity that the war was already lost, not through any single defeat, but through the cumulative weight of industrial disparity made manifest in aluminum and steel. Years later, asked about his wartime experience, he would sometimes mention the captured bomber, the testing, the reports that came too late. He spoke without bitterness, with the detachment of someone who'd survived by accepting reality rather than fighting it. The B-17, he'd say, wasn't invincible, but it was good enough, produced in quantity, and defended by systems that worked. That proved sufficient, and sufficient, when multiplied by thousands, became overwhelming. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.